The first thing anyone saw was the machine, not the plan, not the reason. Just a yellow excavator sitting in the middle of Lila Marrow's best clover ground, chewing a wound into a field that had fed cattle for nearly half a century. By the fourth day, the hole was no longer a hole. It was a hollow, wide enough that a pickup looked small beside it, deep enough that a man standing at the bottom had to shout to be heard, and cleanly graded too, as if Lila had not lost her mind, but had measured the loss before she made it. People slowed down on Route 18. Some rolled their windows down. One of the Fenton brothers said she was finally building herself a duck pond. Another said a woman her age had earned the right to ruin a few acres if she wanted to look at water from the porch. Most of them laughed, not cruelly. Just the way people laugh when they think they understand a thing before it has had time to explain itself. Before October, half of those people would stand at that same fence line and stop laughing. Lila Marrow was 69 years old, narrow-shouldered, weather-browned, and harder to read than the north sky before a storm. She had farmed the north edge of Bryan County since she was 23, first beside her husband, then beside hired help, then mostly alone after her knees went bad and the hired men found easier pay at the grain elevator. She was not famous in the county, but she was known for fixing her own gate chains, known for walking fence before breakfast, known for cutting hay a day earlier than everyone else, and somehow missing the rain that ruined everybody else's bales. At the co-op, she did not talk much. When she did, she talked about soil temperature, ditch slope, late frost, and whether the wind had switched before midnight. That made some people respect her. It made others decide she was old-fashioned. Both groups were surprised when she rented the biggest excavator in the county and drove it straight into a field that still had a good stand on it. Her nearest neighbor, Warren Pike, came over after the first week. Warren ran beef cattle on the West Ridge and had been watching the dirt piles grow from his kitchen window. "You're taking 5 good acres out of hay," he called. Lila shut the machine down. The sudden silence felt bigger than the engine. "I am," she said. "Good bottom ground, too." "It is." Warren waited. Lila wiped clay from her gloves and looked back at the raw basin. Finally, he asked, "What exactly are you building?" Lila said, "A pond." And then she climbed back into the cab. By Friday, the story had reached the Bryan County Farm Supply. Cal Kessler, who repaired combines and enjoyed being the first man to call something foolish, shook his head over the coffee pot. "Rental on that machine alone is going to eat 10,000, he said. "Then diesel, then pipe, then seed. For what? A view." Nora Bell, who kept the store ledger and knew more about farmers' private worries than any banker in town, did not laugh. "Lila Marrow does not spend money to make a view," she said. At the end of the counter, Earl Ransom looked up from his biscuit. Earl had once worked for the soil district, back when every county still had men who knew how water moved across a farm. "That's not a pond shape," he said. Cal snorted. "What shape is it then?" Earl looked out through the window toward the pale spring fields. "Storage," he said. Nobody asked him what he meant. What Bryan County did not know was that Lila Marrow had already lived through the thing they were about to meet. It happened 42 years earlier, in a summer people later remembered only by what disappeared. The creek disappeared first, then the grass, then the shallow wells. Lila was 27 then, with a baby in the house, 38 milk cows in the barn, and a husband who tried to make worry sound like arithmetic. For 9 weeks they hauled water in a rusted tank chained to the back of a flatbed. Morning and night. 2 trips when the cows were heavy. 3 when the pump at the church lot ran slow. They lost hay. They sold cows they had raised from calves. They borrowed against the farm in November and spent 4 years paying for a summer that had lasted less than 3 months. Lila never forgot the sound of empty troughs. Not the sight, the sound. Cattle nosing dry steel makes a hard, hollow scrape that stays in a person longer than any weather report. That was the summer she learned drought was not just a lack of rain. Drought was a clock, and once it started, every unprepared farm began losing time. After that, she watched water differently. She walked terraces after storms. She kept notebooks on where runoff cut the lane. She drew small arrows on old plat maps, marking which slopes bled toward the north ditch and which gullies only carried water after a 2-inch rain. She read extension bulletins no one else wanted once the coffee stains reached page 3. She drove across 2 counties to study a dairy farm that had kept its herd through a dry spell by catching spring runoff in a lined basin and feeding it downhill through black poly pipe. The old dairyman there told her something she wrote down that night. You do not build water storage when you're thirsty. You build it when people think you are wasting ground. For years, Lila waited, not because she doubted the idea, because a basin large enough to matter costs more than a small farm can comfortably admit. It costs land, it costs pride, it costs the ability to stand in public while neighbors decide your common sense has finally gone soft. Then came a wet March, a good cattle price, and a letter from the bank reminding her that her operating line was clean for the first time in 11 years. Lila read the letter twice. Then she called the equipment yard. The digging did not go clean. Nothing important on a farm ever does. At 8 feet, the excavator hit a blue seam of clay so dense the bucket rang against it. At 11 feet, one side slumped after a night rain and had to be cut back at a gentler angle. A hydraulic hose split on a Wednesday afternoon, spraying oil onto the tracks and leaving the machine dead in the field until a replacement came from Wichita. Every delay became a new opinion in town. By the second week, people were saying she had started too large and was too stubborn to admit it. By the third, they were counting her money for her. Her son Daniel drove out on a Sunday, church shirt still buttoned at the neck. He stood beside the growing basin and looked at the scar across the field. "Mom, the bank called me." Lila kept her eyes on the grade stake. "They called me first. They're worried." "So am I." That stopped him, because Lila did not usually give worry away. Daniel lowered his voice. "Then why keep going?" Lila took a long breath. Across the county, the fields were green. The ditches were damp. The spring peepers were singing in water that seemed like it would always be there. She pointed at the basin. "Because green is when people believe water is common." Then she pointed toward the empty trough stacked behind the barn, the one she had never thrown out from that long ago drought. "Brown is when they learn it was borrowed." Daniel did not answer. 2 weeks later, Lila finished the bottom cut. She shaped the banks with a 3-to-1 slope so they would not cave under wave slap. She put a silt shelf at the upper mouth where muddy runoff could slow before entering the deeper pool. She cut 2 shallow swales across the clover field, not ditches, not scars, but barely visible green channels that would guide water toward the basin every time the north slope shed a storm. She poured a concrete collar around the overflow standpipe. She buried a gravity line through the lower pasture. No electric pump, no fancy system. Just elevation pipe and a woman who had spent 40 years noticing where water wanted to go. What she had built was not a recreation pond. It was an on-farm reservoir, a water bank, a way to deposit April and withdraw it in August. By early June, the basin had 6 feet of water in it. By late June, after 2 slow storms and 1 hard night rain, it held nearly 9. People passing on Route 18 could see a bright sheet of water where clover had been. A few admitted it looked nice. Most still called it Lila's Pond. Then the weather changed its voice. It started quietly. A creek south of town quit moving and became a chain of warm pools. The county agronomy note said subsoil moisture was below normal. The well at the sale barn began pulling sand. Corn leaves curled by noon and never fully opened again. By mid-July, the afternoon wind had that dry paper sound. The sound of leaves rubbing without life in them. At the farm supply, no one joked about Lila's Pond anymore. They talked about pump depth. They talked about hay prices. They talked about trucking water and whether a person could justify keeping cows through another month of feed bills. Warren Pike's upper pond went first, then the lower one. He brought in tanker loads twice a week, and every load arrived with a number on the invoice that made his mouth go tight. In August, the county issued voluntary irrigation cuts. A week later, they stopped being voluntary. By September, 2 shallow wells east of Briar Creek had failed completely. There are months when a farm does not break all at once. It simply gets smaller, fewer acres watered, fewer animals kept, fewer choices left in the morning than there were the night before. Lila's basin kept giving her choices. It had not saved everything. She would have hated anyone saying it had. Her far hay field burned down like everyone else's. The south pasture went thin. She sold 12 calves earlier than she wanted, but the reservoir held. At the end of August, after the smaller ponds around Briar County had turned into cracked bowls and green scum, Lila still had more than 11 feet of water at the standpipe. Not because she was lucky, because volume buys time, because depth slows heat, because a basin size to a watershed can hold what a decorative pond spills away. Her gravity line fed 2 troughs without a pump. A small valve sent water to a drip line through the lower garden acres, enough to keep the sorghum alive and hold 1 field of late hay. It was not abundance, it was margin, and margin in a drought is a kind of mercy. Warren Pike came in the last week of September. He did not drive to the house first. He parked by the fence and walked to the water. His boots sank into dust that had once been soft grass. Lila was at the standpipe, checking the screen for debris. Warren took off his cap. For a while, neither of them spoke. Across the basin, a killdeer picked along the mudline. The water had dropped, yes, but it was still there, dark under a white, empty sky. Finally, Warren said, "How much do you have left?" Lila looked at the gauge. Enough to be careful. That was not the answer he wanted. It was the answer a farmer gives when honesty still has work boots on. Warren nodded toward the basin. "I thought you were building a toy." Lila bent, pulled a wad of grass from the screen, and let the water clear around her glove. "No," she said. "I was putting spring somewhere it couldn't run off." That fall, the Briar County Extension Office held a meeting on farm water planning in the high school cafeteria. They expected 20 people. 73 came. Men who had laughed at the counter sat with notebooks open. Young farmers leaned against the back wall. The banker stood near the coffee urn and pretended not to listen too closely. Earl Ransom drew watershed lines on a whiteboard. A state engineer explained storage ratios, spillway sizing, silt control, and why a pond built for fish is not the same thing as a basin built for drought. Then someone asked Lila to stand up. She did not want to. Nora Bell finally said, "Lila, they are going to ask you anyway." So Lila stood. No speech, no victory. Just a woman in worn jeans with sunlines around her eyes and clay still under 1 fingernail, answering questions plainly. How much acreage did she give up? A little over 5. How much did it hold when full? Close to 15 million gallons. How did she move the water? Gravity wherever she could. A small transfer pump only when she had no other choice. Would she do it again? Lila looked around the room, at Warren, at Daniel, at the young couple from Mill Road who had sold half their herd the week before. Earlier, she said. The next spring, Warren cut a basin below his west ridge. Two brothers south of town built a shared catchment across a drainage they used to fight over. The county conservation office added a page to its annual report on farm water storage, vegetated banks, and runoff capture. Cal Kessler stopped calling them ponds and started selling standpipe collars from behind the parts counter. Leela did not become a prophet. That would have embarrassed her. She became something more useful. A neighbor who had been wrong-looking at the right time. When younger farmers came by, she walked them to the basin, not to show off the water, but to show them the slope. She made them stand above the north field and look down. That rain was leaving, she would say. Every storm, every year. We just didn't call it leaving because it was wet when it went. Then she would walk them to the swales, to the silt shelf, to the overflow, to the old dry trough behind the barn, the one she still refused to throw away. Someone once asked if she had known the drought was coming. Lila looked at the water a long time before she answered. I didn't know, she said. I remembered. That was the part Briar County had missed. The strange thing in Lila's field had never been the excavator. It had never been the money. It had never even been the pond. The strange thing was watching someone prepare for a season everyone else could not feel yet. Preparation looks wasteful when the sky is generous. It looks excessive when the creek is running. It looks like fear to people who have mistaken comfort for proof. But farming has a way of separating what feels true from what can carry weight. Rain is not yours because it falls on you. Land is not protected because it is green. And memory is not pessimism just because it refuses to forget pain. Lila Marrow did not save Briar County. She saved what she could reach. 5 acres of lost clover became weeks of water. A foolish-looking hollow became a lesson with banks. And the woman everyone thought was digging herself a pond had been doing something far more patient. She had been saving spring.